Presidential dropouts, social unrest, tear gas, campaigns, riots, and assassinations. We're going back to 1968 to see how similar it is to 2024. Buckle up, it's going to get wild. It's March 31st, 1968. President Lyndon B Johnson appears on national television. He talks to the nation for 40 minutes, and they hold their breath when he drops the bombshell. He's not running for re-election. Now fast forward 56 years, and it's like déjà vu all over again. A little tip of the ball cap there to Yogi Berra for that quotable nugget. But President Joe Biden, facing a nation divided and a world in crisis, winds up making the same stunning decision. Two presidents, half a century apart, both stepping aside in very turbulent times. It begs the question, what would make the most powerful men in the world step away from their job? Were they worn out from their long political careers? Health concerns, maybe? Or pressure from their party for looming concerns they could lose the re-election bid? But folks, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so let's dive deeper into the parallels between these two pivotal years. In 1968, the world was on edge, just as it is in 2024. Back in '68, the Vietnam War was raging, with no end in sight. Young men were dying by the thousands, and the public was growing restless with the conflict. Meanwhile, in Europe, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, crushing the Prague Spring and reminding the world of the Cold War's icy grip. So America was dealing with two conflicts at the same time. Now let's look at 2024. Different places, same tensions. We've got the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. While there's a lot of back and forth about any conflict, the continuing similarities between 1968 and 2024 are truly astonishing if you think about it. And let's not forget the second front, the situation in Gaza, where age-old conflicts have reignited into a full-blown war, and it's a world teetering on the brink. We saw protests in the United States back in the 60s over the Vietnam War from American citizens at home all around the nation, just as we're seeing protests today over the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Now let's look at number 2 on our list of similarities. Let's talk money. In 1968, inflation hit 4.7%, and people were definitely feeling the pinch. Fast forward to 2024, and inflation is still the buzzword on everybody's lips. It peaked at a whopping 9.1% in 2022, the highest rate since 1981, and while it has cooled a bit, it's still got economists and hardworking families up at night trying to figure it all out. Okay, here's an interesting nugget. In 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60. But if you adjust that for inflation, it's about $13.55 in today's money. But even when you adjust for today's dollars, inflation still causes families to feel that pinch. Now, our current federal minimum wage, well, it's still stuck at $7.25 at the national level since 2009. While many entry-level jobs certainly pay more than that today, it still remains a fact that the national average hasn't moved a whole lot in 50 years. And let's not forget about housing. In 1968, the interest rates ranged from 5.3% to 8.2%. Another similarity to today's home rates. In 2024, we're seeing mortgage rates range from 5 to 6, 6.5%, 7%, the highest in over a decade. The American dream of home ownership for many is slipping further out of reach. The prices of homes have increased anywhere from 35% to 400% in some areas, and large corporations are buying up single-family homes as well as commercial real estate, which is certainly a topic for another day. All right, let's turn our attention to the streets of fire. In 1968, we saw riots and protests sweeping across the nation. The assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy sent shockwaves through the country. Cities burned and the fabric of society seemed to be tearing at the seams. Sadly, it was just a couple days after Lyndon Johnson's announcement that Dr. King was assassinated, and a few months later when Robert Kennedy was the target of a gunman as well. In 1968, there were 3 political candidates. Since the Democratic nominee, Lyndon B Johnson, declined to run for re-election, you now had the Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, running for president. Another interesting similarity to 2024 with our current Vice President. Back in 1968, Richard Nixon was on the Republican ticket, and former Democrat George Wallace ran as an independent. Jump forward to 2024, and former Democratic Party member Robert Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., has switched to independent as well. And then there's the sad, tragic similarity to his father being assassinated back in 1968. Finding ourselves once again here in 2024 with a chilling echo of the past, on July 13th, 2024, we saw an alarming attempt on a former president in Pennsylvania. While the attempt on President Trump's life failed, it serves as a stark reminder of the specter of political violence that still looms large and harkens us back to a very ugly time in history. Social unrest has always been there, but it certainly has been on the uptick once again, just like it was in the 1960s. Let's take a look at yet another bizarre similarity: the pandemic panic. While not covered as widely, the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968 and 1969, caused by the H3N2 strain of influenza A virus, it was one of the deadliest pandemics of the 20th century. Originating in Hong Kong in July 1968, the virus quickly spread globally, aided by increased air travel. The virus affected people of all ages, but was particularly severe for the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions. Despite its significant impact, the pandemic received relatively little attention at the time and also in the history books. Flash forward to 2020 and beyond, and the comparisons to the COVID-19 pandemic are again eerily similar. Yet another strange, odd, and interesting coincidence or link between these two time periods. But we are not done yet. In 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, and by some crazy, wild twist of fate, the 2024 Democratic National Convention will also be in Chicago. In 1968, it was the most confrontational political convention in American history. The convention's host, Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago, refused permission for anti-patriotic groups to demonstrate at the convention. They had 11,000 officers of the Chicago PD on 12-hour shifts. There were an additional 6,000 armed men from the Illinois National Guard called up to the amphitheater where it was being held, giving a feeling that the city of Chicago was under siege. There were riots and protests and tear gas. It was absolute chaos, pandemonium, and mayhem. It's almost too perfect, too many coincidences, as if some cosmic puppeteer is pulling the strings and playing with our fates. We know our political environment is ripe for more conflict, and while we hope cooler heads prevail today than it did in 1968, it doesn't bode well when we look at our history, which we must do. We must be able to objectively review history if we wish to learn, grow, and improve as a society. The battlegrounds are shifting. Maybe this time, instead of riot police and protesters on Michigan Avenue, it's Twitter wars and Facebook fights. The violence could be virtual, but the divisions are still very real. And while sadly conflict may spill into the real world, the hope is that people can and will learn from the past. So what does this all mean for us in 2024? No one knows. We're living through history, folks. The choices we make this year could shape the next half a century, just as the events of 1968 molded the world we live in today. Will we learn from the past? Are we doomed to repeat it? Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The history of man is a series of conspiracies to win from nature some advantage without paying for it." As we navigate these choppy waters, remember that knowledge is power. Understanding these parallels doesn't just make us history buffs, it makes us, hopefully, better citizens, better voters, and better architects of our own future. So the next time you hear a campaign speech, read an economic report, or watch protests unfold on your screen, take a moment, think back to 1968, and ask yourself, what would I have done then? What did my parents or grandparents do? And what will I do now? We hope you enjoyed the podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the notification bell on YouTube. This has been Boots on the Hill.